Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Prime Focus, a program that highlights issues of concern to individuals, families, and communities, bringing greater awareness and education with a view to changing the lot of others through anticipated positive actions. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we are in for a very special episode. It's one I've been looking forward to for a very long time. And I couldn't have found anybody better than the veteran that is coming on tonight. Tonight's episode, we will be looking at a very interesting topic, which I know is of concern to many people and families around the United Kingdom. And we'll be looking tonight at the issue of social services and families and trying to build bridges of understanding between the two. Um, I put up a quote that I had seen a little while ago, which has stayed with me ever since I saw it. And it says, I put it at the bottom, the most frequent misconceptions is that the main role of social workers is to take away children from their families. This was in The Guardian in 2014. Well, tonight, our expert is going to demystify some of that. And the question is fostering greater understanding and harmony between social services and families really possible? And I believe the answer is yes. So if you're watching tonight, whether you're a parent or a guardian, or you know a parent or guardian or educator or community leader or social worker who needs to hear this, please share this link with them right away. Share it with as many people as you can. Tonight, I'm going to be bringing into the studio a very important person, as I said, in the person of Donna Thomas. And I'm going to introduce her first, and then I'll bring her straight away into this evening's studio. Donna Thomas, as I've already said, is a family support veteran. That's the way I like to describe her. Has an impressive 40-year background spanning early years settings, schools, social care, regulation, and inspection across multiple local authorities. Her current role is the head of early years and early help, responsible for the local authority early years statutory duties, and also responsible for targeted early help parenting support to prevent children and families escalating to social work intervention, as well as supporting families after social work interventions. In more recent years, she has also taken responsibility for school attendance duties, exclusions, and safeguarding in education. Donna holds a number of qualifications, including teaching, a postgraduate certificate in safeguarding, and a master's degree in early childhood education. She is a governor of a federation of primary schools in inner London. Donna is not just into social work, but she's also leads a youth ministry and is a mother and a grandmother. Ladies and gentlemen, without much ado, let's invite Donna into the studio. Donna, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know it took a while to get you to come on here, such a busy lady, but just speak to our audience so they know they can hear you as well.
Good evening, everybody.
Mhm.
Can you hear me?
Okay, so I'm sure you can all hear Donna there. Thank you again for joining us tonight. And Donna, I have a barrage of questions. I'm hoping that we can go through a lot of these. We want to tap into all that experience that you have, and we believe that there'll be a lot of invaluable insights that will come out from tonight's session. So once again, we have Donna in the studio, so please share the link with other people. Donna, I want to start off with a couple of, let me first of all, do you feel this when you see people talk about this whole frequent misconception? Is this something that in your line of work you feel, or it's something that's far removed from many of you because of your own perspectives?
I think, first of all, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for inviting me in. And whilst I probably don't consider myself an expert, I do have experience that I can share. So that's what I'm going to do tonight. I
Right.
think in terms of the misconception, I think that there are, it depends on your perspective and your interface with children's social care. So when I say, I know we're talking about social workers, but actually they're couched in a department which is either referred to as children's social care or referred to as children and families. And if you are on the outside looking in, and you have nothing to do, or no intervention, no experience of children's social care or the local authority, then what you know is either what other people have told you who perhaps have had some form of contact, or your experience is based on the media. And if you read the news, certainly when something goes wrong, such as Peter Connolly, Victoria Colombier, the reporting on criminal activities and county lines, then your perspective may well be that actually we're just there, or children's social care are there to take your children. I have to stress here that I don't work for children's social care, I work for children's services. And whilst I deliver the early help services, actually I'm not a frontline social worker, and I'm not a qualified social worker, so I'm not speaking as a social worker, and just feel that I need to make that quite clear. But I have worked in children social services, and I'm very much part of the partnership and part of the service from another aspect. So I think that, if you've had friends who have had some form of intervention, you've had children's social care step into family life, it feels unfair for the reason that they've stepped in, or you're not quite sure of why they've stepped in, or you feel that you've lost any form of authority because they've stepped in, then you may actually feel that actually they're just here to hinder, when in fact they're not. So it just depends on your perspective. They are one of the safeguarding agencies, along with the local authority, along with police and health. So from that perspective, they have the same duties placed on them in the same way that health colleagues do within any acute service or community service, and in the same way that the police does. They are one of those statutory agencies that are there to safeguard and to protect. So whilst there might be a feeling actually that, if I just continue and just say that actually the local authority can't afford really to step in, if you step into family life in a way that's not justified, not required, not needed, doesn't safeguard, protect, or help children, doesn't secure good outcomes for them, then actually all you're doing is intervening in a way that is costly to the children, costly to their families, costly to society, and costly to council budgets. Really can't afford that. If you remove a child, you could be paying £2,000 a week to keep that child. If you have a number of children on the register, then in effect your budget is being swallowed up by placing those children elsewhere. If the outcome is not that severe, but actually you've got social workers going in to do assessments, then what you have is increasing social work cases. The number of families that they work with increases. That places a stress on the system and on the individual social worker. So, you really do not want to step in unless it's absolutely necessary. And that is really about either safeguarding children or intervening in order to achieve better outcomes for those children where you believe that their outcomes and their well-being is at risk.
Okay. Well, thank you for laying that context and background for us. I have a question here. It says, is there a bad or vitriolic attitude towards social workers in general? And if there is, so why do you think that is the case? I know you've just sort of explained that even from a budgetary perspective, it doesn't help you to be taking over. In other words, it's not like we're out there to get people like the way an auditor is looking at accounts. And so do you think there's such a vitriolic attitude, and why are people justified in having that?
I think that there's some criticism. There's some criticism at social workers. There's some criticism at the local authority. There's some criticism in the way that work is carried out, and sometimes that's justified. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that, everything is done in a way that's reasonable, fair, balanced, even-handed. Sometimes, as a local authority, you get it wrong. Sometimes local social workers who are human beings get it wrong. But actually, if they get it wrong and a child dies, then you've got the other perspective, the other side of the coin. So I think there's something there about, as I said before, where does the perception come from? It's either coming because people have been subject to a social worker stepping into family life. Possibly they've stepped into family life and supported them, and it has strengthened and built resilience within the family, or they've stepped into family life, and as a result of them stepping in, they've actually lost any influence, any authority to parent within their own home, and their children perhaps are now threatening to call in the agencies if the parent says something to them that they don't actually like. So it just depends on the circumstances, and if it's those circumstances where individuals, friends that we may have who have been subject and have felt that actually it's not been helpful and in fact it's been damaging, then that all that does is birth those types of feelings, not just criticism but bitterness and resentment towards children's social care. If, however, they have stepped in, and they've stepped in a way that has safeguarded and protected a child who possibly could have fallen through the cracks or died, then I think there's some balance and there's some understanding of why they needed to step in. And if they have stepped in, but not stepped in a way that's coordinated and robust, and then you are reading about those children who've fallen through those cracks, then again, you may be expressing, again, sentiments, criticism on the basis that actually they didn't do the job that they should have done. So in many ways, they're between a rock and a hard place.
That's right.
And I think that's part of the challenge that they have. I would say, however, that a significant number of social workers, certainly in London, I know it varies across the country, but a number in London are from Black and global majority backgrounds. They are from working class backgrounds. Some of them have come into the job because they want to make a difference. They want to do the right thing. They want to add their voice to the ranges of voices that are working with children and families, to bring diversity, to bring lived experience, to bring understanding of culture, and to bring a balanced response and a balanced intervention in partnership with parents. You also have some who may have decided on a career because they themselves either were subject to intervention when they were a child within their own family, or they feel that they should have been subject. I've heard past survivors speak, and they make claims, or they assert that there were concerns about my family. They came, they removed the dog. These are real life cases. They removed the dog, but they left me there. They didn't take me. I should have been taken because I was in circumstances of chronic neglect. So there are times when there were criticism because maybe you make the wrong decisions, but I'd like to believe that they make the right decisions most of the time, with a minority of cases falling through the gaps. But really, nobody wants to intervene if you don't have to. You can't afford to.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that exposition there. Right, which sort of leads me to my other question, which you've partly answered already: common misconceptions about social services from people outside the profession. As you've rightly said, more often than not, it will be people who've been affected in one way or other from what is being done, who are the ones who are likely to complain. All the perception has been spread around by such people that, look, they just came and took my kids from me, without necessarily expressing maybe where the failings may have come from their part as well. Right. Okay. What are the powers, since you've already started along that line, what can you explain the role and powers of maybe social workers or children's services for that matter?
So, and again, I say that I'm not a social worker, but
Right, yeah.
certainly their role is set out in the Children Act. So we had the significant changes, only because I also worked under the legislation, the same legislation, is set out in the Children Act 1989. That piece of legislation was updated in 2004. And then you also have the children and social work legislation that came in 2017. Essentially, within the legislation, there are two main areas, Section 17 and Section 47, that social workers work to. Section 17 sets out the duty to provide services to children deemed to be in need of additional support. So it's not necessarily that there is abuse in the family, but there are areas where you're concerned about maybe the health or the well-being or the welfare or the outcomes of those children, and believe actually, for the sake of the children, some intervention would be helpful. That piece of legislation also speaks to children with a disability and ensuring that they get the support that they need also to support their outcomes because of their disability. So it really is about working collaboratively with parents to set out why we're concerned. And it should always be child-centered. So sometimes parents may get, upset, but actually, if it's child-centered, it's about the interest of the child, the outcomes of the child, the welfare of the child, the safety of the child. So that Section 17 really is about a duty to provide services and to work with the parents to address whatever, or to work with them to build their own capacity and their own resilience to address whatever that deficit is perceived to be. The other part of the legislation that they work with, and it's probably the most significant and most contentious, is the Section 47. And that provides a duty to make inquiries if you believe a child is suffering or likely to suffer from significant harm. Interestingly enough, however, that significant harm is not actually defined, but it is about significant harm, and that's a statutory intervention. So parents really don't have any choice around that. If you think that actually a child is at risk of, either abuse, so that's neglect, or emotional, sexual, physical, or domestic abuse, then you will step in and you'll make inquiries, and that inquiries is about an assessment to understand. Someone's made a referral, somebody, whether it be school, whether it be someone in the community that's made a phone call, whether it's come via another agency, whether it's come via the police. I mean, those contacts, those notifications can come from any agency, any professional, and from anybody within the community, and they do. There's a lot of contact, and sometimes it's not justified, and sometimes they are. But if you believe that actually there is harm, then you will step in. And sometimes it may include some of those triggers. I've talked about the main 5 types of abuse, but actually there are other types of other concerns, and that might be grooming. It could be child criminal exploitation. It could be gangs. It could be bullying or cyberbullying. So the role of the social worker is to work with the child and their family to understand the factors that are impacting on them, impacting on their well-being, impacted on their outcomes, in order to work with the parent to address that deficit. But sometimes, if it's safeguarding, they may actually, after doing the assessment and gathering the evidence, decide actually this child is at risk. And so they might decide to use one of the orders that they might have. They might choose to do a safety plan with that child. And the safety plan might say that whoever the perceived perpetrator is cannot have access to this child. So they do an informal, formal safety plan with them. It could be that they use one of their orders, care order. It could be a special guardianship order where they remove the child out of the home and place them with another family member. So they have got a lot of powers that they can use, but they do need to apply to the court for those powers also once they've gathered the evidence. And in many ways, I would argue that it's probably often it's the court that makes the decision. They do the assessments, but the court makes the decision.
Oh, thank you. That's very insightful. So just carrying on from what you said, because you kept saying we work with a family. So are you saying that the relationship between the services and families or parents is consultative and not prescriptive, or it could be both?
It could be both. So under Section 17, it should be consultative, because if the
Okay.
parent at the end of the day, if there are no significant harm and the parent decides, well, actually, I don't want to work with you, I've done so much, and I think actually um, I can proceed, I've got a support network around me, then then it is consultative. But if it's Section 47, then it is prescriptive. And when I say prescriptive, what I mean is it's a statutory intervention, and so the parent is subject to that. The child is subject to that. They're subject to a register where the child is placed until they're taken off of the register because they're deemed no longer to be at risk. So from that perspective, you've intervened, you've stepped in, and you will only step out when you feel that actually the child is no longer at risk. So from that perspective, I don't think anybody would see it as consultative, although there is a duty to work in partnership and there is a duty to engage. If it's been prescribed on you, then you don't necessarily feel that you have any agency in the situation. And that in itself brings its own conflict, because nobody really wants to be subject of a Section 47 assessment. Nobody really wants social workers knocking at their door and having conversations with them. But if you keep in mind that actually this is about the safety and the well-being of the child subject to that intervention.
Well, thank you for that. The crux of the matter is the safety and the well-being of the child always.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to raise a different type of question here, because you've already answered one of the questions I had in mind, which is the role of a social worker in relation to child protection. Vulnerability is a big issue, but vulnerability comes in a number of different ways. Sometimes, obviously, it may not necessarily be the child who may be directly at risk, but as a result of maybe parental or guardian behavior, then they would. Maybe, for instance, if I'm correct, maybe alcoholism or drug addiction from a parent and things like that could raise an alarm. Is that correct?
That is correct. And
Yeah.
so oftentimes, if it's very rarely, if it's Section 17, it's about the child's well-being and their welfare, their outcomes. If the child has a disability, then you need them to get the right services, the right support that they need, the right assessment. And sometimes they're costly, but the local authority under that piece of legislation has to provide it for that child. And oftentimes parents will use that piece of legislation to get the support that they need if they think the local authority is not providing it. When you're looking at Section 47, it's very rarely about the child. It's often about the parent. Even in my own services, which is the early help bit of it, providing coordinated support intervention, it's by consent. But actually, if we know that the child is at risk because of one of the changes to the signs and types of abuse a few years ago was to include domestic abuse. And the reason why domestic abuse was included is because whilst the abuse may not be against the child, it's likely to be between the adults in the home. Actually, there's research understanding that children being in the vicinity, in the environment where the abuse is taking place, even if they're not in the same room, it could be happening upstairs and the child is downstairs. It could be happening downstairs and the child is upstairs, but it does have an impact on that child. It has an impact on their well-being, and that's why it's been included. So if you have a parent who, is working through, it's not about judgment, it's just about understanding the impact of any condition that may have on your ability to parent. So if you have mental health illness quite significant, you might be bipolar.
Bipolar, yeah.
You may be, have another condition. You may or may not be taking your medication. If you are taking your medication, it may still have an impact on you. You may be subject to, as I said, domestic abuse in the home. There may be substance misuse. And if there's substance misuse, oftentimes that's where the money is going. So you may have children who are not fed, children who are not washed, children whose needs are not cared for. They may need to go go to the, to the hospital, to the doctors, because they have a condition and they're not being taken. So most of these things is very rarely about the child. It's often about what the parent is or isn't doing. As the children get older, and then it often becomes about the child, especially if they're involved in criminal exploitation, if they're running county lines, if they're being trafficked. But for the younger children, for all children, but more significantly for the younger children, it may well be what is happening for the parent or the caregiver that's impacting on the child, and the intervention is about keeping that child safe. As I've said, I remember meeting parents who spoke eloquently about saying they were in such neglectful conditions that, they were never taken out of those conditions, and they said they should have been. So we really have to learn, and that's why we, thinking about, when do you intervene? Now, for my own service, it is about working collaboratively with parents. It is about consent. It is about offering, whether it be counselling, whether it be parenting programs and interventions, whether it be the tools to manage your child's behaviour, whatever it is. But if the parent decides to disengage, or they no longer want to give consent, they remove consent, but you are concerned about the child's welfare or safeguarding, then you will escalate up for Section 17 intervention, because you're thinking about the welfare, the well-being, the outcomes and the safety of the child all of the time. And if we're doing that in early help, you can be sure that's what the social workers are doing in statutory services also. So sometimes it does feel as though it feels very intrusive. It feels very intrusive, and of course it's intrusive, but we also need to think about sometimes what is happening because sometimes, neighbours may report you. That does happen. And we know that actually they shouldn't be reporting. And hopefully, a good social worker, once they've carried out their assessments, will see actually, there's no case to answer. We're not going to take this any further. Oftentimes it's the same neighbour that's reporting a number of people or continuously, and that's vengeful. So oftentimes they can cut through that and see that. But other times you can have a number of agencies, a number of individuals, sometimes family members themselves, confidentially raising concerns. Then you need to look into that, because if you don't look into that and something happens to the child, then that's another case to answer for those agencies involved. So I hope I answered the question.
You over answered it. That was so good. Thank you so much for that. Audience, I hope you're getting enlightened by all that is being shared, and please share the link with other people as well. I want to pick a different question this time. What would you say children's services, social services would like families to know, to sort of to thaw any tense relationship or terse relationship, or to also improve things from the family perspective, so that families stay together and are happier?
I think that's a big question, and I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues, but what I can do is just share my professional experience of families that we've worked with, and colleagues that I work very closely with. I think that when we think about it, a minority of parents, a very small minority of children and parents and their families come into contact. So let's put it into perspective, a very small minority. What, however, we have seen is thinking about the types of family that come to our attention. And when you start to think about the types of families, sometimes there's disproportionality. So you may have a number of families from our community who are often, they get caught up into usually a Section 47 assessment. Maybe it then drops to a Section 17. Remember, Section 17 is in need of services. Section 47 is where you believe there is significant harm. So they come to the attention, and usually it's because of physical chastisement. That's usually why they come. If it's not part of real concern about child protection and abuse, it's usually about behaviour management, how they're managing their children. And I would say that in the context, if you know that you were born and brought up in another environment, a different culture and a different context, and then you've come to this country, it's not that it's better parenting one way or the other, but it's different context, then I would say that you need to really understand the context in which you are parenting. And sometimes parents from our community don't. But what we've also found is, and if I just take a step back, we used to have a colleague who his role was to work with FACE groups, community organisation, grassroots organisation, on safeguarding training, safeguarding strategies. And the whole aim was, what we put in place was, if parents came to your attention, and they were often from new to this country, they were from overseas, they came from countries where they parented very differently, then what we would do is, rather than bringing them into the system, into Section 47 assessment, we would bring them together and do some training with them. And that was a way of saying, actually, you're in a different context. We're not saying that you're parenting, because obviously, there's a Eurocentric way of parenting. And then there is another way from the countries and the cultures that are people coming from. So it was about really educating them that you're in this context, and in this context, this is not acceptable. So, but there are other ways. So, let's look at other ways of managing your child's behaviour, because actually speaking to your child, setting boundaries with them, holding conversations with them, making your values clear with them is far more nurturing in terms of children's development than just, shouting at them or hitting them, which actually it's not illegal in England. But if you leave a mark on that child, then you will have somebody knocking at your door to say that actually you've used physical chastisement at your children. We stopped doing that, and now we're having conversations about bringing it back. And the reason why we're doing that is, when you start to look at the data and you look at the disproportionality, you realise actually you're not doing these children and their families any good by always stepping in with a statutory assessment. That stays on their record. It's on the system. There's no getting away from that. And start to think about, how can we stop, almost, we're not criminalising parents, but what we're doing is we're bringing them into a system. Let's stop doing that and start to think about how we can educate rather than use punitive responses to them. So we're starting to bring that back again. And really, it's just because I keep pushing it. We can't keep bringing these families into the system. Let's use education as a tool rather than just responding in a harsh way, which impacts on them. And also with that is, parents, even now I'm talking to parents who have had some form of intervention and now they can't parent their children. That their children some are frightened of their children. The children seems to have the authority and the power, because all they have to say to them is, if you don't let me stay out late, if you don't allow me to go where I want to go, if you don't allow me to talk to you how I want to talk to you, I'm just going to ring social services. It's not helpful. We can't take away parents' ability, authority, accountability to parent their children. So we have to find another way. So I would say, I'm early years trained. So parenting a young child, I did not find difficult. I loved it. However, the minute that they became, the teenage years, it was a whole different ball game. So I had to go and retrain. I had to learn new skills. And, we're talking about children. We're talking about their life. They're only 3 once. They're only 17 once. So let's be the best parents that we can. And I have to say, Rob Parsons, 60-minute parent, Rob Parsons, 60-minute teenager, Rob Parsons, 60-minute mother. They were really helpful. And just looking at another book, which was really helpful, was a parent talk guide, to being a mum or a parent. Another parent book, what every kid wished their parents knew. We have to reskill. We have to train ourselves. We have to equip ourselves with the knowledge to raise the children that we have been given and to nurture them. So I think there's something there about making sure that we understand the context in which we're parenting, that we skill ourselves up for every stage. Every stage of a child is different. it requires a different response. We need to understand that, and we need to intervene appropriately. And sometimes we don't do that. When we've got to be agile enough, responsive enough, and accountable for those children, accountable for their lives, in order to train them up and bring them up in the way to becoming the adults that we want them to be, and to fulfill their purpose and their destiny and not break it.
This is so good. Thank you so much for the things you shared as well. I like the balance you brought to it. This strategy sounds so good. And as you were talking, I'm like, okay, why isn't it used more, in terms of educating people? Because then it answers partly the question. Somebody would say, does children's services understand cultures? Well, of course, I understand the viewpoint that if you're in a country, you have to abide by the rules that govern how things are done in that country. So it's for you to acclimatize or multiculturalize, if you to use that term. But is there a place for that as well in terms of? I know you've just said that you realize that punitive measures or early interventions may have not always have been a good thing to do, and so are you giving people a bit more of a long rope now and watching how things go? Is that what you're saying?
I think no. Well, I'm saying very specifically. So I
Mm-hmm.
think it's about understanding the context and
Okay.
understanding, who's coming into the system and who's
Mm.
not coming into the system and
Okay.
why. And if the data is saying, well, actually, these families, they are coming in because of physical chastisement, you do an assessment on them, and then you close that assessment. I mean, if you do the assessment and the child ends up on the register because they're at risk, that's a different matter. But if you're doing an assessment and you're doing assessments all of the time on very similar parents from similar backgrounds, and then you're closing it, that means you've intervened, and actually you have to question about whether you should have intervened. You've intervened because the legislation says you should. As I've said before, it talks about significant harm, but the legislation doesn't define significant
Mhm.
harm. So you're doing an assessment to see whether or not this child is at risk of harm because you believe them to be. And when you finish the assessment, you're saying, actually, they're not. The parent
Mm.
just needs to
Mm.
understand how to manage the child's behaviour, or how to use different tools to manage the child's behaviour.
Mm.
It's in those circumstances that I'm
Right.
talking
Okay.
about. If you'd done the assessment and 99% went on to, you defined risk, they are at risk, you need to intervene with statutory interventions or an order, that's one thing. But when you're closing it, you've brought somebody through 3 months, 4 months of uncertainty. They may be a professional, that it may have affected their job. And then you're closing it. So you have to question
Mm.
yourself, was that the right thing to do? And in some of these families, it's not the right thing to do. They just
Mm.
need more information. If they've got the information and they ignore that information, and then they're back into the system, that's a different matter. I think there's something here about we're not allowed to smack children. Just looking at the questions there, and it's
Mhm.
not. It's maybe a law in Scotland. I think that law came into Scotland. It hasn't come
Mhm.
into England. So there is no law in England that says you cannot smack children.
Mhm.
They will only intervene if you leave a mark, on that child.
Okay.
So at the moment, there is no law about not smacking. But I would say that actually we really do need to think about the skills that we are using to discipline our children, because we
Mm.
don't necessarily need to smack that child.
Mm.
But there's no point in not putting boundaries in from day one. And when I say day one, what's cute at 9 months is not cute at 4. And there
Mhm.
is no point in trying to put boundaries in place at 4 or at 10 or at 11 when you've not put them in place from the beginning. They
Mm.
need to understand exactly what the values are, what the principles are, what the expectations are. And when they start to push those boundaries a little bit, you actually have agency with that child to bring them back in. But if actually you have no authority over that child, you've been inconsistent in your parenting, today it's yes, tomorrow it's no,
Mm.
there is no rhyme or reason, then what you have is a confused child who will set their own boundaries. So I think we just need to be very clear about being intentional in our parenting. But I'm going to say again, there is no law in this country that you do not smack your child. But if you leave a mark on that child, somebody will knock on your door if it's reported to them.
Thank you. Thank you for those clarifications and insights. I hope some parent isn't jubilating that, oh, you can't smart. As you said, there are better parenting skills that people can learn as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank
Absolutely.
you so much for that. And obviously, yes, I saw a question there which you've addressed about the smacking. Thank you very much. Let's come to the issue of children being removed. I know you've touched on a bit of it, but what I wanted to ask was also neglect in terms of, let's say a parent is very busy at work. In a sense, somebody will say responsible parenting is taking care of your family, making sure there's food on the table. But because of work, then also you're not giving enough time to the child at home. Are these issues that are considered when maybe children's services are looking at stuff, or it's just looked at that there was neglect, no matter what the circumstances are?
I think neglect is an interesting one, and you may have social workers that are on the call tonight. The thing about neglect is that neglect is very, very hard to evidence.
Hmm.
So neglect is not; it's one of the hardest definitions of abuse to actually evidence. And so, if it's a case that you're working and you're not home, if it's an older child, we'd probably be talking about supervision. Are you supervising that child? Do you know where your child is? Because if you're not supervising your child, you don't know where they are. You don't have boundaries in place for when you're not at home. And what I mean by that is, you've got no mechanism for checking where that child is. You've not left them with anybody else. You don't have a system or a process in place for ensuring where they are. And you're getting home late. So really you've lost supervision of that child. And I think that's what becomes an issue. And it's probably not defined as neglect per se, but when you start to think about supervision, when you start to think about do you know where your child is, do you know what they're doing, then they get caught up in county lines, then they're not coming home, they're going missing. It's a collective of things. So it's very rarely one thing. It's usually a collection of things. I've worked with families where there has been chronic neglect. And when I say chronic neglect, it's, you go into the home and actually you can't stay in the home. And because you can't stay in the home, the child can't stay in the home. It's and you're wondering how on earth did it. I remember seeing the mess was probably up to the door handle. And so I'm talking about, chronic neglect. Then you've got other situations where, parents may not actually, the child has a very serious medical and health condition, and you're not getting them the treatment that they need. And you're doing that consistently, putting that child's health at risk along with other factors. So it's very rarely one thing, such as, you're late home or your child is letting themselves in after school. I think a lot of our children will be coming in after school and letting themselves in. So that's not the issue. It has to be a number of significant factors in order for you to be assessing neglect rather than one-off factors. But I would say that, as parents, it's difficult when you're working, and it's difficult if you're a lone parent, and it's difficult if you don't have a support network around you. So hopefully you'll make the best decisions with what you've got, whilst factoring the safety and the well-being of your child, and making sure that there are systems, and that whether that be a neighbour, whether it be friends, whether it be a supervised, organised care at a school club, that there's something in place depending on the age and stage of that child, so that we're not working very, very long hours and we really have lost any form of understanding about where our children are, who's influencing them, who's impacting on them, because they could be at risk and they've not told you. They could be fearful and not told you within their own community. So I think we just have to be, as I said, very intentional about our children and intentional about protecting them ourselves
mm,
so that they don't experience any adverse harm that could have been prevented if we were just asking the right questions, if we were supervising. And let's not conflate that with, having to work, because, you have to work. But making sure that arrangements are in place, strategies are in place, systems are in place.
mm. Thank you so much for the details that you've given there and clarifying this thing on neglect, because that was something on my mind because I keep hearing the word all the time. When it comes to the demographic, I know you talk about the BME community and things like that. Is the interventions, I know it may differ from maybe borough to borough and all that, but are the interventions primarily within the BME community, or is this something that affects different groups of persons, or is this an age thing? Because somebody may say, okay, if it's parenting, maybe sometimes young parents or new parents may not know how to handle these issues. Could it be anything like that, or it just cuts across the board, or it's more the BME community?
I think it will. I mean, I can't speak for London, or maybe I should have looked at some of the data. I think we just have to remember that obviously in London, we London's a diverse population, I guess is really what I'm saying, and in other parts of the country it's less so. So depending on where you are, the cities are largely diverse, and outside in rural areas, country areas, they are less so. So I think it just depends on the profile of the community.
Hmm,
I would also possibly say that um, it depends on what the issues are. So I spoke about something very specific, which around physical chastisement, for instance. But I know that for other communities, previous data that I looked at, actually, working class families, often white working class families, were often possibly also in the physical abuse, not physical chastisement, physical abuse category, and that might be associated more with low income households. So I don't think that we are anymore. But what I would say is that we need to really, I think, when you start to think about when we step into people's lives, either under Section 47 assessments, significant harm, or when we offer services under Section 17, are we even-handed, and are we balanced, or is there any bias in who we offer what? I think that's probably more of the issue. And so when I think about some of our services, so for referrals for early help may be often less our community, but
hmm,
referrals for statutory intervention may be more. When we look at county lines and criminal grooming and into gangs affiliation, are we assessing? Are we intervening early for those boys? Because oftentimes, not exclusively, they are boys. Oftentimes, they are from Black global majority backgrounds, and oftentimes they may have been excluded from school, so they might have been in a pupil referral unit. So when you look at all of those things, it raises the question: could we have intervened earlier? Should we have intervened earlier? What were the signs? What were the factors? So you've been excluded from school. Why? Often around behaviour. Okay, so what intervention did the school give? Who did the school refer to for additional help? Did the school get hold of the parent in a timely fashion, or did they wait until the behaviour spiraled out of control before they
hmm,
then started to get hold of the parent? So I think it's often the factors, not so much who, but it's about often, and in serious case reviews, it often talks about missed opportunities. What were the missed opportunities for these boys? Why are we excluding a boy just before his exams
hmm,
when you had concerns before? what support did you put in place, and who else did you help for help? So I talked about the Children Act 1989, which was updated in 2004, which was amended in 2017 to become the Children's Social Work Act. But we also have the Working Together to Safeguard Children, which actually everybody working with children and families, including churches and faith groups, Scout organisations, everybody has a duty to safeguard and protect children. And that document, that guidance strengthens how we work together, interagency strength. So we're all accountable and we're all responsible for getting the children the support and the help that they need. And sometimes we don't. And sometimes we do, but the parents don't want to engage, or the child doesn't want to engage, or sometimes we've intervened too late. Sometimes the parents have been asking for help for years before the agency recognises, oh, we now need to give that help, but actually they needed the help 2 years ago, and now that child has spiralled, that it's very difficult to pull them back, because now they are in a gang, or now they are in criminal activities, and actually they like it, and they like it because they have, if you like, a street family, they're accepted, they belong, they've got money, and they've got a relationship that validates who they are. So I think there's something about timing and when we are concerned, and that's why when I talked about supervision, yes, having to work is one thing. Knowing where your children are, knowing who their friends are, knowing where they are, knowing what they're doing, knowing what they're bringing home is really important, because if we miss those stages, it's very hard to pull them back later on.
Interesting dimensions that you raise with what you just said there. So for every parent who listening, let's take better care of our children. All right, thank you, Donna. On that point, I wanted to go pick up a follow-up one. You mentioned faith. I just wanted to address that very quickly. In faith communities, sometimes they may have their own tenets. It could be any of the mainline religions. They may have their own way of looking at things. Things you sometimes want to keep it in within a setting, community setting, address it within that. Would you agree that there's a place for what it might be done in a faith community, but then there's also a place for letting, for want of a better word, regulation or safeguarding issues be dealt with by professionals?
I think what I think doesn't really matter. What the guidance says is really what matters. So I talked about working together to safeguard children. Every faith group in the country has to abide by that. They don't have a choice. So the richness of a faith group and the richness it offers children and their families, and the faith community is, if it's robust, then what it will be doing is offering that support to the parents. So hopefully, they will have access to counsellors, they will have access to the support, to experts, to advice, to guidance, to those families within their communities, and they will be able to support them through engagement with any statutory agency. Faith groups, churches, including my own, have got child protection procedures. They engage in child protection training. They work with an agency so that if there are allegations where there are children, there will always be allegations, there will always be concerns raised, and the systems and the structures are in place to respond to those, and to respond to them in accordance with the guidance, in accordance with expectations of this country. And I think we all have a duty to safeguard and protect children. If nobody wants anybody stepping into their life inappropriately, or in a way that's not fair or even-handed or balanced, or in a way that's biased, or in a way that actually doesn't respect the values that they hold, nobody wants that. But if you are in a faith group, then you have to be able to support families and help them to navigate all of that. And hopefully, because you are one of those agencies, accountable agencies, as part of working together, the guidance, the government guidance, then it may well be that you are providing some of that intervention. You're one of the agencies that's providing that intervention. So those faith groups, churches, have a very important role to play with families, and certainly with families if they get caught up with an intervention or an assessment on them, which sometimes may be justified. Sometimes they do. The the assessment needs to be done. If we go back to keeping the child center of every decision, then sometimes those children are at risk.
Hmm. Interesting. That okay. So faith groups certainly, as you said, are also supposed to be an agency, an extension of what maybe government would do. So they have to do their bit as well. But
Absolutely.
then where they cannot handle something, either statutorily or in terms of referral, they can pass something on to other people to take care of. Is that correct?
Yeah, so just to be very clear, so the same piece of legislation that schools, that the local authority, that health colleagues have to adhere to, faith groups, churches also have to adhere to the same part. They have a duty to refer for support for children and families if they are concerned that those children would benefit from additional support, or they are concerned that those children are at risk. We have to refer on. So, if I'm in a church community or a faith group and I'm concerned about a child, I have to refer to the designated safeguarding officer who should be in those organisations, and they have to respond. They can't just say, well, actually, we're a church, so let's just close the door and keep everybody out. That's not what the guidance says, and that's not what's required of us. But I'm
Mm,
saying, in addition to that, you may be the one that's supporting the family through the
right.
process, or you may be the one providing the family with counselling, or you may be the one providing the family with a parenting program if one's required.
Mm. Okay. Thank you for that. So, what do you say to a parent whose child is saying maybe they want mental health, maybe therapy or something because they're stressed and all that? Is that something that Children's Services supports, or the parent should find either in a faith community or whatever to try and get that issue addressed?
Yeah, I think I listened to one of your programs when you had a health colleague on, and I think
Mm.
she spoke about the waiting lists, and those waiting lists are just growing post COVID. So I think there's something that I think we just need to talk to our children. I think we need to understand our children. We need to be open with our children, and we need to be able to have that relationship that they can absolutely tell you anything. And whilst steam might be coming out of your head, you have to pretend that the steam is not coming out of your head whilst they're telling you. That's the relationship you need to have with your children.
Mm.
Because that way, what you're doing is you are intervening early. You know what's going on for them. You know what their pressure points are. You know what the stress factors are for them. So if you are in a faith group and they offer counselling, then you should try and see if you can get an appointment, an assessment with that individual. Otherwise, if you are concerned about your child, then there's the GP. If they're in school, the school can make a referral for that child. I think we need to get the support that we need, but we're also in a period where children, there's a lot being children are exposed to far more than they were exposed to a few years back. And what that means is that they're actually grappling with a lot of information, and we are almost pathologizing our children. We're putting a pathology on them that that makes them. We start to assess them, and we start to define them, and we start to put them in a category, in a box, when actually all they're doing is expressing how they're feeling. And yet we're wanting to define them as something straight away. We need to give them the opportunity and the
Mm.
space and the freedom to speak, and to give them the support and the nurture and the containment in order for them to then find the solutions to how they're feeling, understanding why. But sometimes what we're doing is they say something, we react to it, we defined it, we've given it an assessment, we've given it a name, and we're taking them down a path which may actually be the wrong path for them. So I think there's something there just about having that relationship, listening, speaking, and then getting the support, the right support at the right time for that child. And as I said, some of those child and mental health services, you could be waiting a very long time for them. So you might have to try different avenues. Oftentimes the schools have got mental health workers within their schools. The GPs often have access to those services also, and if you're in a faith group or within your community. So there are lots of voluntary sector organisations out there as well that may be able to offer some support in line with your own values.
Thank you for that. I think I've just got two more questions here. A scenario was painted some time ago to me about children taking from their parents and putting care, and they were allowed to do whatever they wanted. And in the end, they didn't turn out as good as they want. They were, if they stay with their parents. Of course, they didn't give me what the parents had done in the first place. Is there a case there? Are there instances like that? Is it a fact that when children get removed, proper care is taken to sort of match them with like values or whatever to ensure that the child is nurtured properly?
Yeah, so again, this is where I put in that caveat to say again that I'm not a social worker and I don't
Right.
work in the frontline social services team, although I am part of children's services. And so, but I can speak from a perspective of the families that we work with in terms of from an early help point of view, and from schools and from early years. And I think, I can't quantify that. I don't think anybody can quantify that unless we look at the stats and the data around that. But yes, there are perceptions and feelings. If you think about it, for the reason that you are in care is multiple. It could be very different for different people, different children. But obviously someone's deemed that there is a significant harm in order for you to be in care. So you may be with you may be with a foster carer in the foster carer's home, or you may be in a children's home, or you may be in one of those, I'm trying to think of the right word, one of those partial living places where you're living by yourself, but you're supported by an adult. You could be in or you could actually be in a unit for children who are at risk of criminality. So you could be in a number of different placements. And if you're in any of those placements, then the supervision is not going to be the same as the supervision is when you're at home. You're going to have staff who work shifts, who take holiday, who you might see today and are not there, next week. You might have agency staff come in. So there is no consistent relationship taking place. And by that very nature, you're going to have a little bit more independence and a bit more freedom, liberty to do what you want. So I would say from that perspective, that's why, unless a child absolutely needs to be removed for their safety and their well-being, then actually what we want is for the parents to have the support that they need to parent their children successfully at home. And there is no gold star for what parenting looks like. We just talk often about, and the guidance talks about good enough parenting. So we're all good enough parents. We're not perfect parents because nobody is, but we need to be good enough to meet those children's development needs, to provide the supervision, as well as to meet their physical, emotional, and for some, their spiritual needs. So, I think by the very nature that they're no longer in a nuclear home where there is oversight of them, and they're in an environment with different adults and different children, and they're probably taking more risky behaviour than they probably would do if they were at home, and they're probably exposed to things that they wouldn't be, because actually what you now have is a number of children from possibly trauma-informed background or trauma, experience together. So, they're going to influence one another. So I wouldn't be surprised if parents are saying that.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Before I ask the last question, I wanted to just share my thoughts as well on something that I know sometimes some parents do. I think in the chat I did see something like that. That yes, sometimes the children will say we'll call social services, but it's also correct that parents also use that to condition the children. If you call social services, you will never see me again, and things like that. That is that considered abuse in a way of a child's rights, or is a parent within their rights to be able to stop their child from calling for social services or children's services?
It's I don't know that I can respond to that
Right.
particular question. What I would say is that, as parents, if I talked about before that good enough parenting, and if we believe that we are good enough parents, and we are doing and intervening with our children and nurturing them and bringing them up with consistent boundaries and consistent expectations, um, and they know what's expected of them, then in many ways they feel safe, they feel loved, they feel nurtured. Oftentimes children push boundaries with their parents because they know that their parents love them, and it doesn't matter what they say or do, they know that their parents will love them. So the same child who's at home running rings around their parents, and then they go to school, or a childminder or a caregiver, and they're a different child. They're completely compliant in that environment. And that's really because they're with an adult who, they don't know whether that adult loves them. They don't know what that adult's going to do if they push those boundaries. But when they're at home, they're pushing the boundaries because they know that they're loved, and they know that they're cared for, and they know that they are safe. So sometimes parents will use words like, children will use the words, but they don't mean it. And parents will say those things, but they don't mean it. And the child knows that they don't mean it, and the parent knows that they don't mean it. So, it's a different context. It's a safe context. It's a safe relationship. It's a strong relationship. If you're in an environment, however, where you don't have that relationship, it's not safe, it's abusive, then those types of conversations may well be deemed to be emotional abuse. So I think in the main, most children are in a safe home. They feel safe, they feel valued, they feel loved. And so they will push those boundaries because they do. And for others, it's, if it's a threat, if you're threatening, then yes, it could be perceived as being inappropriate and not helpful. But, is that the majority of parents? Probably not.
Very well put. Thank you so much for that. It wasn't meant to be like a trick question for you there.
I think it's always about context. I think that's the issue.
Right.
I don't think one size ever fits all. It's always about the context and the environment, and the environment is different. So in one environment, actually, it doesn't really mean anything, and in another environment, actually, it's quite threatening and quite abusive. It just depends on the context.
Yeah, you're right about that. I just want to just check if there's anything we have in the chat that needs to be looked at. Okay, great contributions, very informative. Yeah, thank you very much, Sheila, for the different contributions. For all who are quietly listening, I believe you've benefited a lot from tonight's session, allayed your fears in many ways, giving you great hopes for the future. If you're a social worker, educator, community leader, parent, guardian, I'm sure you benefited a lot from the different things that objective views from Donna here. Donna, I want to give you the last question here. Say somebody says, well, I'm not in that scenario. I'm not a parent or a guardian of children and all that. I live alone. But how can members, to what extent can members of the public and professionals raise an alarm or concern, or how can they support the process so that we can have a more happier communities, if so to speak? Um, if you can maybe share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, again, it depends on the perspective. So, if you're in the community and you're active in the community, then parenting is not easy. It's hard work, completely hard work, and people are often parenting alone. Um, when I say often parenting alone, I mean they may have come from another country. So even if they're married, their spouse may not be in the country with them. Their extended family may be abroad. Their parents, their siblings, aunties, uncles, who they would rely on, are often maybe abroad. So I think we just need to get alongside parents oftentimes and children. So if we're in a whatever organisation we belong to, whatever faith group, let's just get alongside them. Let's support them. We see them struggling sometimes with children. Sometimes they may have a child with additional needs. Sometimes a child may be just kicking off. Let's just support that parent. Let's not judge them. Let's not criticize them. Let's not make them feel that they're an inferior or a poor parent. So let's just get alongside them. But on the other side, I go back to that working together to safeguard children. It's just been updated this month, actually, 2020, or was it last year? I can't remember now. I think it's this month it's been updated, just hot off the press. So I think that we all have a duty to safeguard and to protect children. So, you have children in your family. You may have children in your friendship groups, you may have children in your neighborhood, you may have children in your communities, you may have children in your faith organization. Let's just let those parents know that we are there with them and for them. But if we're concerned about the safety of the child, let's also not close our eyes and say it's got nothing to do with me. It's that family. If we are worried about a child and we've got good grounds and good reasonable grounds to be worried about the child. We live next door and we can hear screaming day and night all of the time. We see children and they look terrified all of the time. They're outside. I think recently we had a young child that was actually locked out of the house. And a question I had was, well, where are the neighbours? The neighbours must have seen this young child locked outside of the house, not being let in the home by their parents. Let's report it. Every local authority has a line. They usually call it the multi-agency safeguarding hub. Let's ring the local authority, and you can do that anonymously if you are concerned about the safety and the well-being of the child. Let's not just do that because we think maybe. If we're concerned and we have got real grounds to be concerned, then do something about it. So let's first of all offer support, and on the second side, let's intervene if we need to, and not leave the child in a home that's possibly could have an adverse impact on them.
Thank you, Donna. That was a good line to bring the session to a close. Thank you so much for the great insights you've shared so objectively for us. And I believe our audience, and for those who will particularly watch it later, you'd have benefited a lot from today's session. If you're struggling in any way, there's hope, there's help that you can reach out to or for. And Donna has mentioned working together, I believe you said.
Yeah, working together to safeguard children.
To
Yeah.
all right. So I would look for the link and make it available in the chat afterwards, in the description. So anybody who needs to read on that or access that information can do that. I know local authorities too would be able to assist you. But on that note, we want to bring tonight's session to a close. Thank you, audience, for joining us. Thank you again, Donna, for making the time to share these very insightful thoughts with each and every one of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Mm.